Hi, I'm your host Vasco Duarte. Welcome to the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast, where we share tips and tricks from Scrum Masters around the world. Every day, we bring you inspiring answers to important questions that all Scrum Masters face day after day. Hello everybody, welcome to our Team Tuesday this week with Paddy Corry. Hi Paddy, welcome back.
Hey Vasco, thank you. Glad to be here.
So on Tuesdays, we talk about teams, of course, but as always, we start with a question that I guess many of our Scrum Masters always want to hear at the start of the Tuesday episode, which is a source of inspiration, a source of knowledge, a source of growth for all of us. So Paddy, what was the book that most influenced you in your career as a Scrum Master?
Well, there's a lot to choose from, but I think I'm going to go for a book that might be a little bit lateral at first. It relates to the topic of flow, but not from the perspective of Kanban or flow metrics. It's the idea of the psychological state of flow, written by an author called, and I'm going to struggle with the pronunciation, but it's Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, and he is a psychologist. His idea is that if we're working on something that's pleasurable, and if we get into a state of concentration where time begins to melt away, where we're not so much worried about the output or the outcome, we're enjoying the process itself, we enter into a kind of a flow state. And it was a really interesting concept for me. It kind of encapsulated a lot of what I felt as a developer when I was really wrapped up in solving or trying to solve a problem, investigating hypotheses, trying to just get my head around something. And it's definitely influenced how I approach being a Scrum Master, because I think generating or protecting that flow state in a team is a really worthy kind of goal.
Absolutely. And it's something that we as Scrum Masters should be aware of. In the startup culture, if you will, there's this idea of the maker schedule. I don't know if you've heard about that.
Oh, I haven't heard of that one, actually.
Yeah, so maker schedule is, there's this contrast, one would say, between maker and manager. I think the original blog post is by Paul Graham, and I'll put the link on the show notes for that. And it talks about the different needs of a manager and a maker. While the manager's work can be interrupted, and it happens mostly through meetings, the maker's work happens through that state of flow, right? And we need to reach that state of flow and then keep it for as long as it is feasible to keep. So I think that those two concepts, the concept of flow and the concept of the maker schedule, are probably very useful things for us as Scrum Masters to be aware of, because we need to help the teams also reach that state of flow.
Absolutely. And I think one thing that the book also represents quite well is that this kind of flow state isn't just about productivity or generating positive outcomes for a team or for yourself. It's about how it's enjoyable, and the activity of doing this thing is something that is, the state of flow is akin to a state of happiness. It's in the same ballpark, that it's something to seek out. If you can find more of those activities that generate that flow state for you, you're probably on the right track, and you're probably gravitating towards a career that suits you, or a role that suits you. So I think it's a very interesting topic for a team to consider as well.
Absolutely. All right, now we turn our attention to the teams themselves and how sometimes they develop these behaviors or patterns that over time lead to problems. So Paddy, tell us that story. Walk us through how that team developed that particular behavior over time. What were the details of that, how it emerged, and of course, what were the consequences? So walk us through that story, Paddy.
Sure. I'll tell a story. It's from the not so distant past, but I guess I'll refer to it as in generic terms, and hopefully people listening who know me might recognize the story, but we won't mention anyone by name. But I think one of the more destructive tendencies I've seen, or self-destructive tendencies I've seen from teams under pressure, is something that I wouldn't blame any team for. I think it's a definite easy trap to fall into. It's the idea that we don't have time for refinement. I think it's the idea that we need to start building. We don't have time to go to a meeting room. The people we need to talk to have busy schedules as well. We're not going to get everybody together in one room. Or the idea of look around the room, how many people are here? What is the cost of this? We're wasting time. We should be writing code. It's a trap that I've seen, well, in the not so distant past, but also in early in my career, the rush to start. And the reason why it's self-destructive is it creates a context in a team where it's difficult to know where we are in relation to our goals. It's harder to produce meaningful information from that kind of team context, particularly in a Scrum Master role when stakeholder requests come in. And this becomes a vicious circle. Anywhere there's an information vacuum creates more questions. So when you have less information radiated out of a team, more people will join the team context and ask what's going on. So this feeling of we must go faster is gradually eroded. And I mean, it's self-destructive for a number of ways, or for a number of reasons. But I think the dynamic in the team suffers because in this context of feeling under pressure to build, there's also more pressure to give status or indication of where we are. And I found that a very challenging context anytime I've experienced it.
But isn't that kind of I've seen that many times actually, and when I look at it and think through what I witnessed in those teams, it's kind of an interesting, if weird, contradiction, right? And I've seen this where teams are kind of, as you said, pushed to write more code and write code faster and increase velocity, and they don't have time to be in meetings. But then there's like this underlying constant interruption of multiple people from multiple areas of the company coming in and asking for status. It's a manager that comes in. It's a project manager that comes in. It's another team's manager that comes in. It's the head of project management office that comes in. And it's like this constant interruption, while on one side we're saying, hey teams, stop having meetings, start developing more. On the other side, we're also saying, hey teams, stop developing code, tell us where you are. Isn't this like a bit of a contradiction?
It is, and I think there's this kind of balancing act that as a Scrum Master, I think you have to be very keenly aware of. I think there's a responsible amount of time that we should spend on refinement and on producing artifacts. And the team is very keenly aware of when their time is being wasted, generally, and the team will be generally quite vocal about that. But I think there's also a responsibility for the Scrum Master to play a role that, protects the team from that self-destructive situation where they're spending and the balance has shifted too much towards build, go fast, go fast, go fast. And we're not radiating any information out from the standard artifacts of a Scrum team, for example. So the product backlog is shallow. We don't have an idea of whether we're going to achieve our milestones unless we talk to a developer. I think there's a balancing act there that a Scrum Master can play a role in helping a team develop and, see the value in those artifacts.
So one of the tips that I usually give my teams, and one that I use myself even in my own work, is that when there's questions for status, and let's assume for a moment now that we're not trying to solve the refinement problem, but when people are being asked for status, what I usually tell my teams is, okay, if you're being asked for status and being interrupted in your work, then it probably means that your iterations are too long. So if you're doing 4-week iterations, then go to 3. If you're doing 3-week iterations, then go to 2. And if you're doing 2-week iterations, then go to 1, and see if that helps alleviate the constant interruption for status reports. reporting. Is that something you've played with, Paddy? What are your experiences when it comes to creating that, as you said, radiation of information towards stakeholders?
Yeah, and I think in terms of a product backlog or an iteration backlog, and those kind of moments in the rhythm and cadence of a Scrum team where we, open ourselves up to feedback and input, if we can get those stakeholders involved in those elements and artifacts of a Scrum team, I think their input can be very valuable. So, for example, like you say, if this sprint is too long, perhaps we're going to get requests for feedback during the sprint. But if we have, and I think most teams that I've worked with are on this kind of 2-week cadence, if we have stakeholder feedback in the sprint review, that's really appropriate. I think that's great. And, requests for, well, what are you working on next? Have you considered maybe the value of working on number 4 before number 3? Because, from my perspective, here's the value. Those kind of conversations are great. Whereas mid-iteration, mid-sprint, it's a bit more tricky because there's work in progress and switching costs and interruption of that flow state.
Absolutely. That's one of the things that we definitely should help our teams realize, is that everything we do is kind of an investment into our productivity as a team. So if we do 5 minutes refinement, that's an investment. Is that 5 minutes enough? Perhaps yes. If it is, keep it. If it isn't, then of course increase that investment. Investment we put in, or the time we put in into handling that stakeholder feedback, and maybe change how we radiate information. That's something that will help us later on not to be interrupted, right? And we need to have those conversations with the team, right? If there is a pain, there's probably something we can do to improve and answer or overcome that pain.
Yes, I agree 100%. And I think if requests for information of individuals or of a team are frequent, I think we need to ask, why is that happening? Is there anything that we can do to protect the team from those frequent interruptions by investing a little bit of time at appropriate moments, like refinement or like iteration planning? Perhaps there's just a straightforward email update that can go out after iteration planning to say, everybody who wasn't there at that iteration review, you didn't hear what we were planning to do, but here's the output of our plan. Now here's our goal. Here's the 11 items in our iteration backlog. If you need an update, let us know, or let the Scrum Master know. And that might just head off some questions that come into directly to people. But asking why is always important.
Absolutely. Thank you for that story, Paddy.
No problem.
Tuesday is Team Day here on the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast. But tomorrow we talk about something that goes beyond the work we do with the teams. We will talk about how to lead change and what our guests have learned from leading and participating in change programs during their career. See you tomorrow. We really hope you liked our show. And if you did, why not rate this podcast on Stitcher or iTunes? Share this podcast and let other Scrum Masters know about this valuable resource for their work. Remember that sharing is caring.